This set of criteria should be publicly required to be asked of any recipient of U.S. funds, whether they condemn unequivocally radical Islamic theology, they condemn unequivocally the violent terrorist acts of Hamas and Hezbollah, whether they condemn unequivocally the terrorist front groups in the United States and urge that they be shut down. And any equivocation or obfuscation in response to that should be used appropriately and not giving them the grants. I do not want to deny them their civil rights in maintaining even support for jihad. They're entitled to do that. But there's no constitutional right to get funding or recognition from the State Department.
That is my next guest, testifying in front of the House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Terrorism back in 2008. And I would have to say, in retrospect, if these guys had paid closer attention to Steve Emerson, we might not be talking about what happened, what went wrong with the Arab Spring, and why we had such a disaster in Benghazi. But if you learn nothing else from this interview, you will learn it is never a bad time to talk to Steve Emerson about terrorism, particularly with a new CIA director about to be interrogated by the Senate. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Fred. It's unfortunately I'm the bearer of bad news, but I think people need to know what they're up against so they can ensure that we're not victimized or eviscerated on our national security.
Okay, lay it on me. Tell me about John Brennan.
Well, John Brennan is now has been nominated to be CIA director. Mm-hmm. He's been in charge of he's been at the National Security Council as a top advisor to the president for the last 3 years on counterterrorism. And in a word, he has been the point man for recognition of the Muslim Brotherhood front groups in the United States, and also for the evisceration of our language in terms of not being able to utter the term radical Islam. He has been also involved in squashing conferences that have featured anybody who utters the term radical Islam and instead has recommended or substituted for them Islamic front groups for the Muslim Brotherhood.
All right, let me just stop you right there, because I think we need to clarify. When we're talking about Muslim Brotherhood front groups in the United States, we would be talking about the Council on American Islamic Relations, CARE, the Islamic Society of North America, the Muslim Public Affairs Council. These are the groups that you're talking about for the
right.
Muslim.
There are actually scores of groups.
Yeah.
And they're actually enumerated in a film we just did called the Grand Deception.
Yeah, I want to get to that in a minute.
But yes, these are front groups. They don't use the term radical
of course not.
Muslim Brotherhood in their names, but all of them are known because of their own documents to be front groups for the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States, and they do their bidding here. And the problem is that this administration won't even let the term radical Islam be used and doesn't think that the Muslim Brotherhood is a totalitarian ideological movement, but rather a democratic movement. So our support for President Morsi, who is a fascist dictator in Egypt with a totalitarian movement behind them, extends to the same recognition of these groups here in the United States as if they were constitutionally, libertarian or small democratic groups, when in fact they're essentially the embodiment in the U.S. of the same Muslim Brotherhood movement that now dominates many countries in the Middle East.
Well, now, these organizations that you refer to, these Muslim Brotherhood front groups, usually go under the auspices of a civil rights group or a public affairs group. So they have, to some degree, mastered United States public relations techniques. But I wanted to go back to your point that you made, but I think we need to reemphasize it. And by the way, we're talking to Steve Emerson, he, the founder and CEO of the Investigative Project on Terrorism, the place where people who need to know about terrorism go. But to the point of guys like John Brennan and other top-ranking administration officials actually trying to expunge our language from words like Sharia and terrorism, that has affected you as an authority on this subject, hasn't it? Hasn't it restricted your ability to brief people who need to know this stuff?
Well, here's the irony. I mean, my organization, the Investigative Project on Terrorism, has worked behind the scenes a lot with the FBI, with other law enforcement agencies, in prosecutions, indictments, and let's say forfeitures of charitable front groups. I've spoken literally since 9/11 143 times for gratis, of course, we don't take a penny from the U.S. government, to FBI and other federal law enforcement agencies. And yet, last year, I was suddenly banned from speaking to any federal law enforcement agency, especially the FBI, since I was considered by the leadership of the FBI to be, quote, somebody who was offensive to Islam, when in fact the criteria for what was offensive to Islam, and it wasn't just me, it was many of the experts that have been talking about radical Islam. And again, we make the distinction between radical Islam and Islam. It wasn't just experts that were expunged. It was curricula. It was documents. It was PowerPoints. So there's been a whole purge within the FBI and the Department of Justice of anyone and anything that is considered to be offensive to radical Islam, not Islam itself. And that, of course, is a danger to our national security, also a constitutional denial of free speech.
Well, let me go to that, because the guy that supposedly is going to be our next CIA director has said this. You probably know this quote by heart. Hezbollah started out as purely a terrorist organization back in the early 80s and has evolved significantly over time. And now it has members of parliament in the cabinet. They are lawyers, doctors, others who are part of the Hezbollah organization. And so, quite frankly, I'm pleased to see that a lot of Hezbollah individuals are, in fact, renouncing that type of terrorism and violence and are trying to participate in the political process in a very legitimate fashion. Now, if that's true, Steve, if we're now welcoming these guys in because they're doctors, then we should have a White House reception for Ayman al-Zawahiri, right?
You're 100% right, because the Muslim Brotherhood itself, which gave birth to Al-Qaeda, like Ayman al-Zawahiri, and to Hamas and to Islamic Jihad, are made up mostly of doctors, lawyers, engineers.
Absolutely right.
And in fact, now they run the Egyptian government, and they haven't given up their hatred of the United States, their hatred of Jews, or their support for terrorism. And the notion that somehow, first of all, I defy Mr. Brennan to name any Hezbollah parliamentarian that has renounced use of violence, or that has renounced terrorism carried out by Hezbollah, or that even has said that Hezbollah itself is a terrorist group. Look, Hezbollah knows that to the way, in our film we have a scene where some Islamic leader says, the way to conquer the world is ballots or bullets. There's no in between. And that's what these groups understand. They're going to pursue both methods, both ballots and bullets. It's exactly what Hezbollah has pursued. So it's now part of the government, but it's still a major terrorist organization.
And unfortunately, the next CIA director seems to think that they are, dare I say, another one of these secular organizations. Now, quickly, I need you to tell me about The Grand Deception, because I know you put this movie out, and I think people need to see it. Can you tell us how they can get a hold of it?
Yes, it's called Jihad in America, The Grand Deception. There's a website called www.granddeception, one word, granddeception.com. You can order the film there or go to Amazon. And it's a pretty eye-opening film, because it includes lots of covert video and audio of radical Islamic groups, again, speaking behind closed doors, as opposed to what they say to the New York Times, or as opposed to the fact that they're presented by the mainstream media as moderate groups. It shows them endorsing, financing, and raising money for terrorism, or raising money for radical Islamic organizations that basically support terrorism.
But it's these guys, the people who run these organizations, like Mohammed Majid, who runs the Islamic Society of North America, they essentially have a direct pipeline to guys like John Brennan and the President's new Chief of Staff, Dennis McDonough, do they not?
They all do. I mean, one of the things we did before the election was to go through the White House visitors log, millions of records, and we found that there were at least 400 to 500 visits, a minimum, because we didn't have time to finish, of Muslim Brotherhood leaders in the United States, such as Mohammed Majid and others. And by the way, he's the head of a group that's an unindicted co-conspirator in the largest Hamas money laundering trial, that have met at the White House over the last 3 years. Not one moderate Islamic group or member or official has been invited, yet these Muslim Brotherhood group front groups have been invited hundreds of times, and they have a direct access and pipeline to the president, to the vice president, to the national security advisor, to the head of the CIA.
Okay. Well, Steve, we're going to have to leave it there. Keep up the good fight. The movie is Grand Deception. The Investigative Project on Terrorism is a website you need to go to, and a guy you need to hear from is Steve Emerson. Thanks very much, Steve. We'll be right back.
You're welcome.